right, welcome to the Forge. Today, I'm so excited. I have to be honest. Tara and I have been looking forward to this conversation for a while now because when we get to interview such a diverse group of people, and today really kind of hammers that point home. And so, for some of our listeners, you'll know that I've built an airplane. I started in my garage, built an airplane, finished it obviously in the hangar. It took me almost 5 years to build my airplane. And usually I can walk into any room, share that story, and kind of, not have any competition. Today's guest can trump me. I built an airplane. Today's guest, Cara Brookins, built her house. And it goes even, it's even more amazing that she had no construction experience. And she did this partly by watching YouTube videos and then a lot of trial and error. So this just, it's such an amazing story to me to think. I think of building my airplane and then I go, wow, that's just a drop in the bucket compared to building a house. And we'll talk about what that house looks like maybe a little bit later. So as we, kind of unpack this story of grit, resilience, and mental toughness, we can say step aside Navy SEALs and ultra endurance athletes because Cara Brookins is ready to join this group. And so, Cara, I'm so happy that you're here. And let me say one other thing. We were introduced through, and this is another guest that was recommended by Allison Levine. So I want to give another shout out to Allison Levine. So thank you for that. So let's just jump into this. Cara, tell us about this house. I mean, this house is not I don't know if I'm going to use this is a derogatory term. It's not a shack. This is a real house. Tell us about this house that you built.
Yeah, this house is what happens when you give your kids a pencil and a piece of paper and say, "What kind of house do you want to build?"
Oh my goodness.
Um, yeah, they didn't draw a tiny house. They drew the house plans for a 3,500 square foot house. I have four kids, so they drew five bedrooms, a three-car garage. They went all in with let's build it big. So I know that building an airplane is not a small thing either, though. But I think that when you were talking, the thing that struck me the most is you're talking about grit and resilience and strength, and I was thinking of when I started the house, and those are the opposite of the things that I was feeling at the time. And I think I'm amazed by how often that happens, that the times when other people see us as the strongest and the most resilient are when we were feeling so low, so desperate, that we were just kind of trying to cast a net out there and, well, let's see if I can make this one stick. And really that's what it was for me. When I started building this house, I felt like I had messed up in a lot of ways. I'd made a lot of mistakes. I felt broken. I felt like my kids and I were really desperate. And the best thing I could think of to fix all of that mess was building us a really nice, safe place to live.
And let's back up before we go further into the story of what got you to the place of building the house. I want to lay the groundwork for what we're talking about here, because if you've missed it, we've said built a house several times. We don't mean contracted someone to build a house for her. There are actually pictures you can see of Cara and her children, and you'll tell us their ages when you were doing this, Cara, in a minute here. Physically, from day one, from design to YouTube to, I'm guessing, Home Depot to boots and jeans on the ground, picking up bricks and laying this entire 3,500 square foot structure as a family. So really, I want to set that stage because you're the first person I've ever heard of to do something quite
I'm
like that.
definitely not the first person to build a house, but maybe with, a 2-year-old. The youngest was a toddler out here. And then the oldest three were 17, 15, and 11. So probably in the way that we did it, that it was pretty rare and it was pretty primitive because we didn't have a lot of money. So, when you say, yes, we laid the bricks, we didn't just lay the bricks. We hauled the water from the neighbor's pond to mix the mortar in a wheelbarrow to lay the 1,500 foundation blocks. So, it was doing everything the hardest and most primitive way. Stick building the rafters because I couldn't afford to have a crane carry pre-built rafters in. It was doing everything in that primitive way. And yeah, boots. We didn't have boots when we started. We didn't have any of the proper gear. I was using cheap hobby tools. The things you would normally use to maybe put an IKEA bookshelf together is what I was trying to use to build a house. And we were putting our feet into plastic bags, like bread bags, like your Sara Lee bread bag. We'd wash that out, stick it on our foot, and put our old tennis shoes on to try to keep our feet dry while we're building a house because we didn't have the right kind of protective boots to stay dry. So very, very,
Gosh,
very primitive, every step of it.
I'm just sitting here smiling. You can't see me obviously because this is an audio podcast, but I'm smiling, and I'm just thinking to myself, I have friends, and not to pick on my friends, but I have friends that are single mothers, and they go, I can't find an hour to go to the gym because they have small children at home, and I get the challenge there, but I think Kara might be a good example of, hey, find a way. This was I mean, your kids were part of your work crew, right? I mean, they were very active members in building this house. Is that correct?
Oh, I think it's so important. People say that I built a house. I certainly did not do this by myself. I was a 110-pound computer programmer. I could not carry a sheet of plywood unless I had one of my kids on the other end of it. And that was such an important part of every aspect of it. It was teamwork. And right from the start, it was teamwork, not just from a physical aspect. They weren't just the work crew or the gophers, but I needed their minds in it. I needed to know, we didn't have smartphones. We started this house in 2007 and 2008. YouTube was brand new. So when we were looking up how to do, how to frame a window, how to build a wall, this was back at home on the family computer we all shared in the den and making notes on post-it notes that we would then like stick to a piece of wood out on the construction site. So, very, very different time. So I needed to know what my kids remembered from each step. So if we'd watched a video how to frame a window, when we came out to the construction site the next day, I needed how do you remember that? Like, how did they frame that window? Bring me some wood. Let's start cutting. Let's lay it out. And if my 11-year-old said, no, that's not how they framed that window, I had to go with her way. So everybody trusted and knew that their input was essential, and it was valuable. And when your 11-year-old sees that you took her advice and you cut the lumber the way she said, there's a different kind of investment there, and there's a different kind of pride in it. And the way that those kids showed up every day was reflected.
Oh, and I so want to ask you questions about that, especially since I think roughly a decade has gone by since the kids were
Yes,
involved, as to how that helped shape some of their lives growing up. But I got to back up. Did you say you used to be a computer programmer?
yes, yes.
You
So
went
I
from
was.
computer programmer to construction worker overnight.
Yeah, I think that is important. I never wanted to build houses. That was not my goal. I was not a contractor, construction worker. I didn't have anyone in my family who was. I was a software developer and an author. I have 7 fiction books, and I had several that were published at that time. And then I eventually, wrote a book, a memoir about building the house. Um, so yeah, you can't get more like behind a keyboard than that. That is the opposite of a construction worker. But I think it's important that there's so much of the mindset that was important to construction work or important to taking on a task that we didn't know how to do, because so much of programming is just this figure it out mentality. You have this idea of this piece of software that you want to develop or that somebody has requested, and there are no rules. However you can come up with in whatever language you want to write it in and whatever interface you want to create, you just have to figure out how to make all that work. And it's a lot of just if then. If I do this, then this will happen. If I want this result, I have to do this. So, there's so much of that I brought from programming to this, physical job of building a house. And I think that's important. I think that mindset is what made it work.
And Where were you in the beginning of all of this? I mean, I think of like the project that I'm researching right now and have been researching for probably about 2 years is how to redo my own kitchen by myself. I find it a fun project. I want it done my way. I want to try my hand at something that I have no idea what I'm doing. It's such a little project in comparison, and to me, it's a hobby. It's when I get really like with a lot of time on my hands, one day I will have researched enough to do it. What happened to bring you to a point where you said, okay, I've got a 2 year old and I am going to YouTube my butt off and build a house? Like, how do you, was it a hobby? Was it something you just decided, I've got to learn how to do this? Were you trying to teach your kids? What brought you to this?
Well, like I said in the beginning, it was this level of desperation that we had reached. And we had gotten there because I had been married more than once. I had married a man who slowly descended into full-blown paranoid schizophrenia. And even though we divorced pretty soon after he became really dangerous, for more than a decade, he came after us.
Hmm.
He stalked us. He threatened us. I had to hold him at gunpoint. There were numerous things that happened to the kids and I that were absolutely terrifying. And we moved multiple times trying to get away from that situation, but you can always be found. Um, we had lived with that for a long time. And while all of that was happening and the kids and I were afraid, I met a guy who was a firefighter, who was strong, who was physically very protective, and married him. And he ended up being very physically abusive. So the opposite of the protection that I was looking for. And that's when the kids and I started building the house because I had gotten to this point where here I am again. I'm alone. I had 4 kids. And I started looking, it wasn't so much the 2 year old as it was the oldest kids. I had the 17-year-old and a 15-year-old who were about to leave the house. And I just kept thinking, they're never going to want to come back. We were
Hmm.
going to lose the house we were living in. So I had to find some place for us to go. And I thought, I could buy a small house, kind of stack the kids in bunk beds in the corners. And they're never going to want to come home to that again. And they're not going to be proud to live there. This is not going to build us up. And so I started just kind of coming up with this, what can I do to help the kids and I? We've been through this trauma. And because we'd been through the trauma together, I wanted us to go through some sort of a healing process together. So I looked at kind of the typical, we could run a marathon together, we could climb a mountain together. What are some of the things that we could do that would be unifying? And they just weren't enough. I needed something that at the end I wouldn't have a picture of us crossing a finish line or a picture of us on a mountain. I needed like a physical thing. And I started looking at, art projects and different things like that. And then of course this, in the back of my mind every day is where are we going to live? We don't have a house. Where are we going to live? So enter YouTube and I started Googling, how to fix up houses and things like that. And I started finding things about how to build a wall. And I'd look at it and think, well, I know how to do all of those things. I've cut a piece of wood before, I've nailed in a nail before. That's all you have to know to how to do to build a wall. And then I started looking at plumbing. How do you run gas lines? Well, I've used a torch to make jewelry before. It was really tiny. It wasn't the same as copper pipe or, the same as running gas lines, but it was the same principle. And I thought I don't see a single thing in all of these videos that I don't think I could figure out how to do. Now, obviously, collectively, all of those things were massive. And the timeline that we ended up on was nearly impossible because I had to get a construction loan that gave me a 9-month time frame to build the entire house. So, all of that together was massive, but each little thing seemed totally possible. And that's how I went into it.
What a great, I mean, that's such a great lesson. I think for all of us is when you're looking at a daunting task, just break it down into little bites and say, okay, what can I do, and then just start from there. So I like that. Now let's go back just a second. You, thank you for sharing. I'm sure that's not a fun story to share of how you got to that point of desperation. But I also wonder there might be people out there listening that are in a similar situation. And so, how, you know, you've been struck by, some trauma, as you said, and how do you maybe get out of that victim mindset and say, I'm gonna take control of my life, or at least control of some parts of my life, and I'm gonna move forward. So if you're somebody out there that's stuck, maybe where you were, how do you move forward? Because I'm sure there's a lot of fear and a lot of I don't know, intimidation of taking that step. Can you offer any advice on what got you moving forward?
Oh, sure. I think the number one thing that people were telling me, when they would see that I felt stuck, that I felt really paralyzed by the situation I was in, is they would tell me, just take these little steps, just do a few things. Just get up today and make a cup of coffee, just put your socks on. And I got really frustrated because at the end of every day I would have, a pot of coffee and a pair of socks, and I
Mhm.
wanted more than that. And, then it was go to therapy, read these books. People were offering these things. And I knew that as far down as I was, I needed something major, something massive. And that for me, and I think for all of us, it had to be a physical action that I took. So I think the idea, if you feel stuck, get yourself up and moving. Pick some aspect of your goal, whatever your biggest goal is, that you can turn into a physical action and get up and moving. There's so much healing and therapy and health, for our brains, for our bodies, in just getting up and moving. So finding something where I could immediately, I mean, for us, it was, a pickaxe. It was real action. It was hauling block, it was hauling water, it was ripping through a sheet of plywood. And, aside from the physical and mental benefits that gives you, there's this sense of power and control when we are able to change something in our physical atmosphere, when we can, you know, see at the end of the day our results, and that they are something. And it doesn't have to be a house or an airplane. That can be an art project or whatever your work. If you're building a new business, there are physical aspects of that, from file systems and things that you can create, even if it's post-it notes that are color coded across your entire wall of your bedroom, things that you can look at and see that you were up and moving and achieving that day.
So perfectly said. And I'm curious now to ask you about the kids in the sense of, am I right to think you built this house in 9 months?
Yes,
Oh my
yes, we had
goodness.
to have their certificate of
Whew.
occupancy in 9 months, or we could lose the house. The bank could take it back.
And so the kids got, obviously, they had no choice. They had to get heavily involved in this. It's now been over a decade. Your oldest is 30.
Yes.
And I see you right now sitting in the house you built, and the kids come back and I imagine visit from time to time. And how do you think this has affected their life? And you have given them this physical thing. It's not a photo of a marathon, it's not a photo of a mountain. It is a physical thing they get to come home to and bring their friends or their significant others and say, I helped do this. How do you think this has really had an impact on them as people?
No, a huge impact. When we started building the house, because of so many of the things that they had gone through, they were uncertain.
Hmm.
They were weak. They would hold back. And of course, after building the house, these kids were fearless. I mean, put anything in front of them. My oldest son, Drew, moved up to Alaska and went to college up there, and he would climb ice walls and mountains and snowboard. My oldest daughter moved to Washington, D.C., and then to L.A., and now she's running her own business. My youngest daughter, crazy, she went and lived in a tent in the Ozark Mountains through snowstorms to help a family build a straw bale house for a
Oh,
summer,
wow.
through a spring and summer. Now she lives in Canada and has her first baby up there. She married a Canadian, so she's in Ontario. And my youngest son, 15 years old, so he's, I think, the bravest of all of us. He's going through a year of virtual school, which
Oh,
is
my
a
goodness. Yeah.
really, really tough thing. But just this idea that there's so many things that my kids will do now, where if I were to hear somebody else's kid is doing it, I'm like, oh, yay, that's amazing. But my favorite things are the ones that make me say, "Oh, but wait, do you want to think about this a minute?" Because I love that they're that fearless. Um, that they're not afraid to fail. And that's the number one thing that we learned out here is that you do not have to go into any project knowing that you're going to succeed. You can know that you're going to fail 5 or 6 times on it. One of our favorite tools was a reciprocating saw, and it's just a saw with a metal blade in it that will cut apart your mistakes.
Hmm.
So when we'd frame a wall wrong or a window wrong or whatever that thing was, this sawzall would cut through the nails. So we could cut it apart and reuse the wood to try again. And it just made the kids know, like, it doesn't matter. You try it. Like, what's the worst that could happen? And I remember that the first couple of times I said that to the kids, we would become paralyzed by things. Like every project that we started out here, we had no idea how to do at the beginning of the day. So, at first they'd kind of stand aside and wait, and nobody wants to make the first move or the first cut. And every move feels so big and profound. And so I started asking, what's the worst thing that could happen? And at first they'd say things like, oh, and an airplane engine could fall out of the sky and crush us all, or you could cut off your left arm. And I'm like, guys, like we learned the safety precautions, so we're not going to cut off our left arm. Airplane engine, not going to happen. The worst thing that could happen is we're going to do it wrong and we're going to have to do it over. Can you live with that? And if you can live with the worst case scenario, the likely worst case scenario, then you can move forward with no fear. And that's what I see them doing now. When my son was going to move to Alaska, he had these last minute doubts. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't go. And he had almost talked himself out of it. And I said, Drew, if you go up there and you hate it, what's the worst that could happen? And he said, I'd have to move home. I said, son, you live at home now. You're already living the worst case scenario. That's where you live now. Go to Alaska. So I think that that was just so important. It was so important for them to see that and be fearless.
It sounds like that's a mantra. What's the worst that could happen?
Right.
Maybe there's some words of wisdom there. So how do you think? I'm not a parent, but how do you think? I mean, any advice for parents out there? How do we cultivate that in our children? Do we need to build a house to do this, or do you have some tips on how can we create children that say, "What's the worst that can happen? Let's give it a try," and maybe have that growth mindset and that resilience to do bold things. What would you say to that?
Kids watch us. They watch us really closely. And if we are trying things, knowing, I don't know how this is going to turn out, this could turn out terrible, but I'm willing to jump in and give it a try. I'm even willing to fail really big and publicly on this. And that's how important it is for me to give this a shot. They're going to see that, and they're going to see that over and over again, and they're going to see it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal to fail. And most of the time, you can find some way to succeed. Maybe not the first time, maybe not the sixth time. But if it's something that you really want that's important to you, you'll find the resources, the skill, whatever it is to make it happen. And if not, it wasn't for you and you'll try a different thing. Your life, your world didn't end because you failed at one thing.
And we've talked a lot about how it's helped the kids in their lives. I'm curious about you. What does it do once you have done this super huge thing? And oh, by the way, you learned it all on your laptop on nifty old YouTube. Um, where do you go from there? Like, are you just a YouTube fiend now, or do you learn everything? Is there anything that can stop Cara, or you're like, no, I can figure out the solution?
Oh, I mean, I'm still doing projects constantly. I'm building a bench right now out in my shop. I built a desk over I mean, we've renovated like half of this house over COVID, from painting to art to building structures. I mean, there's always something going on. But I think beyond that, it is things like I quit the day job as a computer programmer. I wrote a memoir about building the house, which was really tough because I never planned to tell anybody. It was a secret when we were building. It was something we were ashamed of. So
Mm.
this idea that not only did I write a book about it, I then decided to share it from stages where I became a full-time professional speaker. And again, like I was a computer programmer and a writer. You cannot get more never on a stage than that. You know, I was very much introvert, hide behind the keyboard girl. So, learning to do that by watching YouTube videos, by pulling apart comedians and stage performers, and how do they do this, and how do they share a message, and how do they teach something but still tell a compelling story, and how do you move on a stage, and where do you put your hands, and all the things that we wonder. All of that was watching YouTube. And now I have a podcast, so you guys know everything that goes into that. I just started a new podcast, so everything that I do is done with that whole, let me see how I can string all this together. I'm sitting in my library right now, and I've got lights on either side of me that are propped up on brackets that I made myself with my 3D printer, so I could swing them into the bookshelves when I'm not using the lights, so it turns back into a living space. From everything I do is like that. It is a, and I'm not afraid to try. And I think most importantly, maybe I move into it very quickly.
Mm.
Very quickly past the. I used to spend a lot of time wondering, thinking through and planning. And now, when I have an idea, if I think, I think I want to build a bench for my bedroom, and I think it needs to be about 6 foot long to go under these mirrors, and I have a slight picture in my head of what that will be. 10 minutes later, I'm on my way to the lumber store. And
Wow.
I mean, because I know if I let that sit, I'm going to think about how hard it is. I'm going to draw 25,000 different designs of it. I'm going to talk myself out of it, and I'm never going to do it. But if I jump right then when that idea is exciting, you've got all those neurons firing in your brain. It's the exact right moment when your brain and your body is giving you the energy to go after it. Do it. So that's how I do it now. And that means I'm constantly calling like one of the kids from the house and saying, okay, I'm at Lowe's and I've got all this lumber laid out, but I didn't actually measure the place that I'm putting this. So can
Right.
you get a tape measure and go measure this wall? And can you also tell me exactly how many inches the light switch is from this? I'm doing that constantly. And the people at the return desk know me really well because I have to buy 7 things that I might need. But you know what I have at the end of the day? I built a bench, I built a desk, and somebody else is still sitting there drawing their 50th iteration saying, someday I'm going to build a desk.
Oh
So
gosh.
true. Mm.
This is great because I feel like I do this too. I overanalyze, I overplan, and I've learned through a lot of self reflection that that's my way of procrastinating.
Mm.
And if I continue to plan, then I can never fail, right? And so you can get stuck in this mode of plan, 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 and never act. And so I know that I've got to break out of that at some point. And so what a great lesson for us all, I think, to just commit to action, maybe slow down a little bit more than Kara so you can,
No, don't.
but maybe find
Don't
that
leave me all
happy
alone with this problem.
find that happy medium. This is great stuff. I mean, this speaks to me. I mean, I'm somebody that's built an airplane, so I like to get my hands dirty and get down and and just figure things out. And so when I hear you saying, yeah, I use my 3D printer to make some light brackets, I'm like, this is great. Let's talk about your book for a second. Rise, How a House Built a Family. I got an advanced copy. Thank you for that. So I got to skim through some of that. I was fascinated by the idea that each one of your chapters alternates between rise and fall, rise and fall. What is your thinking behind that?
I spent 6 years writing that memoir. I was a fiction writer. And so I understand story structure pretty well and the way that I wanted to share a story. And I really struggled with the idea that I didn't like flashbacks. I didn't want to start with a bunch of negative and then move into building the house. And I didn't want to flashback throughout. And so I struggled with the idea of how to tell a compelling story that didn't leave out the reason I did it, that didn't leave out the bad stuff, that I didn't just find an excuse to skip the stuff that was hard to tell. So I decided that the easiest way to do that in a way that kept the story compelling throughout, um, and told the stuff that honestly I didn't want to tell. The stuff that it would have been so easy for me to write the rise chapters and say, well, we built a house and it was lovely and it was like a Disney movie, and you know, but to say like, here are the ways that I really messed up. Here are the mistakes I made. Here are the terrifying situations that we were in, and um, this is the catalyst. This is what really started it all, and this is why we built the house. And so I alternated by telling the story of us building the house in all of the Rise chapters, and those chapters are longer also than the fall chapters. And then I inserted between every one the fall chapters, which are sort of the flashbacks, which are the time before, which are the things that led up. And there are a lot of really terrifying things in some of those. And I think it helps to understand that no matter what you've been through, no matter how hard things have been, um, that there's a way for you to still reach whatever your craziest, biggest dream is.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that. And we're really big on this podcast about this idea that, we interview a lot of people that are, I'm going to put it in air quotes, successful, but we like to bring this to, kind of put a spotlight on this idea that all of these successful people have had those moments like you talk about. And I imagine that was not easy to put that out there for the world to read. So I think that took a lot of courage.
It's a terrifying thing. The first versions of the book that I wrote didn't contain all of that. They were just, oh, we built a house. And, they had just minor mention of why and what happened before. And I had to write a lot of versions before I figured out, what's missing here is the true honesty, is the really deep parts, are the why. But, even then, the book, when I finally did finish it, and I had a great agent, and the book went to a big auction in New York. A lot of publishers wanted it. And my agent called me and said, after we got the first offer and we saw that it was going to auction, she called and she said, Cara, this is your last minute to pull this back. Once we say go on this auction, you can never pull this back. And there's some really hard stuff in here. And I don't know how it's going to go for you. And then she said, do you want to do this? And I said, whew, I did until you asked it, until you asked me like that, because, you write it and you're kind of all caught up in the excitement of all of this, and to really think about like, what's this doing to your children? It's easy for me. I'm a grown up and I can own all of this, but you're putting this out here for kids who, well, they all kind of signed off. The youngest was still really young then. He didn't sign off, and you're talking about them, their personalities, their difficulties, their father. There's so many things that you're talking about that are hard. And I thought in that moment, my thought was, what's the alternative? If I don't share this book, if I just say no, we're not doing it, pull it back, I wrote it but I don't want to share it, then that means the alternative is just being silent. And how many victims of domestic violence have had to stay silent, have had their voices taken from them? Somebody's got to be that mom. And that means somebody's got to be that kid too. And I said, go, let's do it.
Wow. Thank you for being that person.
Yeah.
And you are lucky. You're right. You had a great agent. She was really looking out for you. So that's amazing. And, Ron and I were talking about this before we got on the podcast with you. It's kind of an amazing success story. I mean, you've said you have your own podcast, you've put out a book on this topic, but the number of people absolutely that have viewed and been and seen what you have done absolutely blows my mind. I think we read that 2 billion people, from 75 countries,
just in the first year.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, I said, Ron, wait, what's the population of the planet? That's like a quarter of the population of the planet has been enthralled by this story of yours. And now people are asking you to be a keynote speaker, which you've mentioned. You're helping other people kind of turn their ideas into finished projects. This is kind of an overnight success story.
Yeah,
How does that make you feel?
The global response was just insane, and
Wow.
continues to be. In fact, yesterday I sent this long email to my kids in Russian that, somebody from Russia sent. I said, "Oh, this is an awesome email. You guys, you run this through a translator. You should read it." Um, every day, messages from all over the world still. The story came out in 2017. Before the book came out, the story hit the media, and it was nuts. Within just a couple of weeks, I did, good morning Poland, good morning Italy, good morning Turkey, Indonesia. It was just crazy. And of course, talk shows and the Today Show at the house. In fact, just this year I did the Tamron Hall show. So just crazy how big that became. And of course, the book is out in Chinese and Russian, and it's just baffling. But ultimately, I think that this just for some reason touched a point that was a person doing an unlikely thing and succeeding. And everybody that read it came away with, or saw the story on Facebook or wherever they saw it, came away with this idea that if she, this really unlikely, inept person, and I totally was that, if she could somehow bumble through this insane project and end up with a house, then I could do whatever that big thing is that I want to do. I could start a business. I could build an airplane. And I get, those are the messages I get. I just started I built a backyard yoga studio and I'm starting my own business. Now I wrote a book. Now I'm going to become a ninja, which is one of my favorite ones. Yeah, I mean, I get these messages and it's like they feel like my story gave them permission, which they didn't need.
Mm.
They didn't need from me. They had what it took all along. I didn't give them anything new. They're just using the resources, the skill, the intelligence that they already had available to them. But it opened a door where they thought, if this was possible for her, then this other thing is possible for me. Mm. I mean, that's I get goosebumps just talking about that because it makes me so happy to get those messages. And from people of all ages. I got this barrage of messages early in COVID, which was a really nice thing when the world was crazy. um the story, our story was a 2 or 3 page reading exam in Tunisia. It was the
Really?
reading portion of their version of the ACT. So they read the story and then they answered questions about it. Well, then like 300,000 people took the test, high school students. Then like a third of those sent me messages on social media and sent me little voice messages, and they came in, some in English, a lot of them were in Arabic or in French, and just tons of messages about what they were going to do. So I mean, what a
Oh,
way to open
incredible.
open the door.
No
It's
kidding.
exciting.
I'm right there with you. My hair stood up too. So I love stories that are inspiring like this, that show people what they're capable of. One of the things that we talk a lot about on this program is you don't know what you're capable of. I mean, most people that I work with, they don't yet know what they can pull off. And so sometimes it takes somebody like you, Kara, to show us, hey, look what we can do. Look what I can do. And if I can do this, you can do this. And people say the same thing to me about my airplane. That's amazing. I'm like, I'm just an ordinary guy. There's nothing special about me, and you can do this too. So I love that message. So what is that? Going back to Tara's question and all of what we just talked about, what's that like? I don't buy into this idea, by the way, of overnight success. We know that you didn't get there overnight. This was a lot of work that you put into to arriving at this doorstep. The world sees it as an overnight success, but we all know that's not true. But as you sit here right now, I mean, do you ever just like pinch yourself and go, "What in the world? How did this happen?" I mean, I just can't even fathom what that would be like to go from where you were before you started building the house to where you are now. And tell us what that's like.
I I guess I don't think about it in that terms a lot because I always have another big goal. Like there's always something more I want to do, right? I'm still setting things that I haven't achieved. So I certainly don't look at it as, oh, I've done everything I want to in life. That was fun. There's so much more. But there was a moment. In fact, I said this to my kids after the story came out, and I was doing literally round because it was every country. I was doing round the clock media, and I was exhausted. And like 3 or 4 weeks into that, I said to my kids, I wish I could have a day to go sit on a mountaintop with my notepad and just read through it because I would flip through it and I was like, oh yeah, that was Ellen's producer. Oh god, I forgot. Like I did this show, and like it happens so fast, and you're blocking things in every 30 minutes. You've got another interview, and you're popping onto something or flying somewhere and doing something that you don't have time to process it. And I think we all need to probably take more time to just, can I just sit and like celebrate a few of these wins before I set the next big goals? And honestly, I think that COVID, of all the negatives, there are so many positives in the amount of time that we all had to reflect, to really understand our perspective and maybe alter our perspective if needed on life, on our goals. And so yeah, I mean, I think that I have done that. I have taken those moments to pause and look at that. And every now and then I still will run across one of these pieces of paper in my files, and I send a little screenshot to the kids of like, look at this, like, ABC, CBS, NBC, like all these people that I talked to that day. And it's like all crooked and sloppy because I hadn't eaten or slept. And, I would try to say, I'd be sending messages to the kids who were my oldest daughter, like quit her job to full time, just manage that for a while. And she would sit in the other room just slotting things in on my calendar, and she wouldn't tell me who it was. She would just tell me camera, this is a camera or audio. Otherwise, you'd just like freak out if you'd look at your calendar and see who all these people were. So I wouldn't even know who I was about to talk to.
Wow.
Um, but I lost my train of thought there. But yeah, anyhow, so and when I'm writing those down, those notepads are just the sloppiest mess. And then of course, like the book was optioned for film, and then we were going to do a TV show, and we were pretty far along in that process. I got to co-write a screenplay, which was fantastic. I co-wrote that with Kate Angelo, who she wrote Will and Grace, some of that, and some stuff with Jennifer Lopez and Cameron Diaz, some fantastic writing. So I got to co-write a screenplay about my life. I mean, how in some ways it's disturbing, and you feel like you're losing your mind for the duality of reality versus Hollywood version. I don't even know what happened anymore. What's real. Um, and I, of course, then it was optioned for a TV show, and my oldest daughter and I got to do a sizzle reel to host a TV show, and then COVID happened, and everything came to a screeching halt. In fact, both of those options expired in 2020, and with COVID, we've never renewed those. I don't know if we will. But that experience was just, when you're looking at the number of producers that I got to talk to and interact with and fly out to Hollywood, and that whole experience. Yeah, that's kind of like pinch me stuff, right? And
Unreal.
scary. Like, there's
And
so many things
scary,
that go with
yeah.
that. People think it's all happy and it's exciting, but this idea of selling your life, which is what you're doing if you agree to have a film made about your life. So it was a tough decision. We walked away from a bunch of times, and that's why we may not renew it. You sell the rights to your life. You no longer own your life story. I had to go through attorneys just to get permission to tell that story on a stage anymore, because I no longer owned it if I sold it to somebody else.
Wow.
They can do whatever they want with it. They can represent you and your children in whatever way they want.
Mm.
And that is how you will be known for the rest of your life. So
I never would have thought of that.
it's tough stuff.
Yeah.
It's tough stuff. And I negotiated as co-producer into my contract, so I would co-produce the film, which felt really powerful going in. Like, I'm a producer, they're gonna have to listen to what I say. And then you realize that's kind of one of these things where they were just like patting you on the head, saying, okay, sweetheart, to everything you say. um, yeah. So it's a fantastic roller coaster ride, is what it is.
Let's pause on let's pause on this because I have a fun question here. So, I've never thought about this, but as we were getting prepped for the show, I'm thinking, all right, wow, what would it be like to have a movie made about your life? And so I said, I wonder who I would want to play me in the story of my life. So Tara, who would you choose to play you?
I've been asked this question before. I am so bad at this. I think I think it would have to be someone funny. So I land on Tina Fey. Yeah, I
Oh,
think
yeah.
it would have to be someone that could really take the punches that have come with my life and just turn it humorous. What about you,
Oh,
Ron?
that's a good
I
choice.
like Tina Fey's great. I get a lot of people will say Daniel Craig. I kind of like maybe a little
Oh,
like Daniel Craig or Jeremy Renner. So I'd probably choose. I like both of
I'd
those
choose Jeremy
actors.
Renner for you.
I'd choose
Yeah,
So
Jeremy Renner. Daniel Craig, I mean, I guess, I don't know if it's just the Bond, he's a little bit too serious.
I agreed. Yeah, it doesn't fit you
Yeah.
quite, Ron, but Jeremy Renner for
look at that.
sure.
Kara is already assessing me. She thinks I'm not serious. So
Well,
Can you
now
share
that
with us?
we've
Yeah.
answered this,
Or is that
well, I
like,
mean, since the
who
option
would you,
is expired, I mean, I have no contract with anyone right now, so I guess I can do whatever the heck I want, is what I can do.
so who would you choose? Who would you choose?
Well, I got to, as part of this process, I got to, have a meeting with Nicole Kidman, who was part of this, and I mean, she was fantastic. I mean, if you can imagine, okay, picture this. Nicole and I were speaking at the same event, like Kentucky or something, I think is where we were. Anyhow, we're speaking at the same event, and I'm gonna go. I'm waiting backstage to meet her, and we had a little meeting, and so she comes out from this curtain where there are like, I don't know, 3,000-4,000 people who were listening to her do a little interview, and then she comes out a little interview. Nicole Kidman did a little interview,
Yeah.
and then she comes, behind the curtain, and she comes to the top of the stage, and she's like, she sees me, and then she runs and she's like, "Oh my God, Kara, I'm so happy to see you. I'm so glad you're." Can you imagine?
No, I cannot.
Take
I
that moment.
cannot
I have
imagine.
pictures. I have photos of that moment. And then and she is no life. So she said, I'm 5'4". I'm not very tall. I was wearing heels. So was Nicole, and she's like 7 foot tall. So she's like towering over me, and she's just beautiful. So she was a lot of fun. It was great to imagine her. And in fact, when we were writing the script, she was the person that we had, as in our head of like, this is who we're working with. Um, but then later we also talked with Sandra Bullock. Also Jennifer Aniston was part of it, but Sandra Bullock was the one that was really like, I want her.
really? Oh, wow.
And I
Yeah.
think because what she would bring is, I think some of the physical, brutally hard scenes, like Nicole could have nailed those. Those were her. She likes to get really down and dirty. But Sandra would have to stretch for those a little bit, but she could bring a different level of warmth to the mom part of this and
Mm.
show that struggle in a more empathetic way, I felt like. So, and then she's like quirky. She has that, like, she would look like, I feel like Nicole Kidman could build a house and be like badass. I did not look badass out here. I looked like Sandra Bullock building a house, is what I looked like.
Oh,
It
that's
was,
great.
it was a mess, and it was a lot of mistakes, and it was a lot of really bad hair days. And, I don't know. That's who I would pick.
Oh my gosh. What a
I love
There are
fun
that.
so many
conversation.
others,
Yeah.
right? Like, I
Yeah,
mean, there are
I
so
was thinking
many.
Julia Roberts or something like that.
Okay,
So,
and she was actually my first pick, but she wasn't with the producers. She wasn't one of their picks. So,
huh? This is so
but
much
that would be
fun.
like my dream. Like, all of the movies that I've watched from, like my era, would be, yeah, she was my top pick.
Wow. Well, no joke, Kara. I'm like already in my brain thinking, okay, what hardcore project am I going to go get myself into this
Good.
weekend?
See,
So
see,
it's infectious.
let me put Tara on the spot.
I want
Tara,
to hear about your kitchen too
yeah,
sometime. We have to chat about your
planning,
kitchen.
quit
That's just
planning
my
that kitchen,
procrastination kitchen. That's what I'm going to call
quit
it.
planning and get to it.
I need to get
Here's
to it.
here's
It's
one of
true.
the things that I do all the time, and this is what you're going to do to your kitchen. So when I have a project that is like that, like I'm talking about it. I had one. It's a wall like right out here in my dining room, and I had hung some pictures on it. We had like the Today Show coming to our house, and it was a blank wall. We printed pictures off the internet, framed them, and hung them up there. It was horrible. It was ugly, and it was like that for like 8 years or something stupid, because it was done like, eventually we're going to fix it. Well, then we had a Japanese crew coming in here to film something. And I was like, I can't live with that wall one more day. So here's how I solved it. I went in and I took all those pictures down, pulled all the nails out of the wall. It was a mess. It was a mess. Everything stacked up in there. Now, guess what? You have no choice. You got to fix it. So
You
go
know,
in your kitchen
yeah,
and make a
sledgehammer
big
is what you're
freaking
saying.
mess.
Just
Yeah.
sledgehammer that thing until
Because,
it's you can't even recognize it, and
and,
then I have no
and
choice.
Burn
ruin
the boats.
whatever is the thing that, like, push your own buttons. Like, what is the thing about redoing
Mm.
your kitchen that's going to drive you nuts the most? You're going to have to move your refrigerator, your microwave can't be there, your dishes
Oh,
are
I
going to be
like this.
exposed. Whatever that thing is, make that mess. The
So
thing that's going to bother
create
you the
pain for
most.
yourself to actually do the hard thing. I really like this.
It works
Yeah, I like the idea of the refrigerator in the middle of my path. That
because you are
okay.
not going to tolerate that very long.
That is such a great point. What a good
Yeah.
message on
So make a
so
mess.
many
You have to be
levels.
willing to make a mess, and I mean, it creates an instant project. You have a, and
That
it also like sets a timeline, right? Like you've
right.
officially started.
You have officially
And that,
started, yeah.
I mean, that does different things in your brain, right? You have different little neurons that are firing off, that are setting, you're coming up with new ideas. You're coming up with new ideas faster because you've given yourself this idea. I have officially started this project.
Mm, I love it. Now, just because we're rounding out the show, I have to ask you, we've talked a lot about success today and
Mm-hmm.
failure. You've shared some failures as well, but now we'll ask you to share your biggest.
Well,
So,
I
or
mean,
one that comes to mind, like what do you think that might
I
be?
mean, my biggest failure, I think, is really what we've already shared. So I might share a different one. I mean, the biggest failure is not having my kids in a safe and healthy environment for as long as we had to tolerate that. And well, a lot of it was out of my control. I think that you always feel like you could have made different decisions or things you could have done differently. So I think that's my biggest failure. And now you know what I did to try to remedy that situation. But I have a favorite failure that is after we built the house. The kids and I started like different businesses. Like let's because we weren't afraid to start any kind of a business.
Sure.
So there were multiple different businesses that we started, but most of them failed. Um, but one of them that we had put a lot of time, energy, and money into, and we were all working in it together, and it did not work. And we worked on it for a couple of years and nothing was happening. And I decided, and I had started it as an LLC, and we decided like, hey, this is not worth it anymore. So I did the thing where you dissolve the LLC, and I got this envelope in the mail from the Secretary of State that is like a certificate of, I don't know how, dissolutions, a certificate saying you dissolved the business. And it looks like a certificate. Has like the scroll work around the edges. And I was like, this is the coolest thing in the world. I just got a certificate of failure. I'm totally hanging this on the wall. And the kids are like, oh my God, like burn that. We don't ever want anybody to know we did that. That was the most embarrassing thing ever. And I'm like, no, do you know how many people in the world are saying, someday I'm going to start my own business?
Hmm.
You did it. It doesn't matter if it failed, if it succeeded, if you're a millionaire, or if you lost every penny. You did that thing. And we should have that more often. Like, we shouldn't just have proof of the times that we tried something and succeeded, because it took just as much guts to go in there and try that thing that didn't. So, yeah, that was my favorite failure, to hold that up and go, no, look, kids, like we did this. Because every single time I speak, one of the things that I ask people is, what are you going to do? What's your big thing? What are you going to do? And so many of the people will say, I'm going to open a restaurant. I'm going to start my own business. I'm going to do this thing. And it's like, okay, well, how long have you been planning that? Well, my whole life, 20 years, 10 years. And yet, if I ask them the details of that, like, okay, where's your restaurant? What are the tablecloths going to look like? What's on the menu? They have no idea. It's just this loose little dream that they've done. So if you can have the certificate that you went out there and you had a name for your business and you incorporated it and you tried but you failed, like you still took the steps and did it. So we should get certificates of failure. I've got a couple.
Oh, I love it. And we're out. That's the end
Yeah,
of the
that's
podcast.
the
What a
end.
great one. That's such a good one. Good story.